In 1952, in a cave cut into a cliff above the Dead Sea, an archaeologist reached into the darkness and pulled out something that should not exist. Not because it was ancient, the site had already produced ancient documents by the dozens. Not because it was unexpected, the team had been systematically excavating the caves of Qumran for years, but because of what it was made of. Every other document found in those caves was written on leather or papyrus, fragile materials that had survived 2,000 years only because of the extraordinary dryness of the desert air. This one was different. This one was made of copper. And when scholars finally managed to read what was hammered into its surface, they found something that turned the entire archaeological world upside down: a list. A precise, detailed, location-by-location list of the greatest hidden treasure in the ancient world. Nobody has ever found it. Before we go any further, make sure to subscribe to the channel and leave a comment telling us what you think is hiding in those 64 locations. Now, to understand why this scroll matters, why it has driven archaeologists and treasure hunters and biblical scholars to obsession for 7 decades, we have to go back long before the cave. We have to go back to the treasure itself, because the gold described in that copper document did not appear from nowhere. It had a history stretching back 1,000 years before the scroll was made, and that history begins with the most legendary king the ancient world ever produced. Solomon, son of David, ruled Israel sometime around the 10th century BCE. The accounts of his reign, preserved in the Hebrew Bible, describe a king of almost supernatural wealth and wisdom, a ruler who received tribute from every corner of the known world, whose throne was covered in ivory and gold, whose daily table required 600 measures of fine flour and 60 measures of meal, and 30 oxen and 100 sheep, not counting deer and gazelles and roebucks and fatted fowl. Whether those numbers are literal or poetic hardly matters. What matters is what Solomon did with that wealth. He built a temple, not a modest house of worship, not a simple altar on a hilltop. A structure so elaborate, so expensive, and so deliberately magnificent that its construction consumed 7 years, and the labor of tens of thousands of workers, timber from Lebanon, stone from the hills of Judea, bronze cast in the Jordan Valley, gold imported from Ophir, a location so distant and so disputed that scholars still argue today about where it actually was. The Temple of Solomon rose on a ridge in Jerusalem that would become the most contested piece of real estate in human history, and inside it sat the most sacred objects the Israelite world possessed: the Ark of the Covenant, the great menorah, the 7-branched golden lampstand that burned continuously in the sanctuary, the golden table of showbread, silver trumpets, sacred vessels of gold and bronze accumulated over generations of worship and donation. The temple was not just a religious center, it was a vault, the greatest repository of sacred wealth in the ancient Near East, the physical embodiment of a covenant between a people and their God. For 3 centuries it stood, and then, in 586 BCE, the Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar II arrived at the walls of Jerusalem with an army that had already crushed every power between Mesopotamia and the Mediterranean. The siege was brutal, and the outcome never truly in doubt. When Jerusalem fell, Nebuchadnezzar did what conquering kings did. He stripped the temple of everything valuable, burned the building itself to the ground, and marched the population into exile in Babylon. The treasure of Solomon's temple went east, into the heart of an empire that would itself be gone within 50 years. When the Persian king Cyrus the Great conquered Babylon in 539 BCE and allowed the Jewish exiles to return to their homeland, he reportedly returned the temple vessels, thousands of gold and silver objects recorded in careful inventory in the book of Ezra. The returning community rebuilt the temple, simpler than Solomon's but standing on the same sacred ground. And for 5 centuries, through Persian rule and Greek conquest and the extraordinary upheavals of the Maccabean period, the Second Temple stood and accumulated its own treasury. Donations from Jewish communities across the entire diaspora, the temple tax paid by Jews from Egypt to Rome to Babylon, the offerings of generations of pilgrims. By the 1st century CE, the temple that Herod the Great had massively expanded and beautified was one of the architectural wonders of the world. Ancient sources describe it in language that sounds like exaggeration, until you consider that the retaining walls Herod built around the Temple Mount were so massive that their lower courses still stand today. The Western Wall, still the holiest accessible site in Judaism, is Herodian stonework. The temple itself was clad in white marble and gold, visible from miles away, its treasury one of the richest in the ancient world, and all of it was about to be destroyed. The Jewish revolt against Rome that erupted in 66 CE had been building for decades. Roman governors had pushed too hard, taxed too heavily, offended too many times. When the rebellion finally came, it was fierce and total. The Roman garrison in Jerusalem was massacred. The governor of Syria, sent to suppress the revolt, was defeated and driven back. Rome's response was the kind that only a superpower can deliver. Vespasian, one of the finest generals of the age, was sent with 4 legions. His son Titus completed the campaign after Vespasian became emperor. The siege of Jerusalem in 70 CE lasted 5 months. Inside the walls, the situation became catastrophic. Factional fighting between Jewish groups consumed resources that should have been used for defense. Famine killed thousands before the Romans killed more, and the Roman assault pushed steadily inward through the city's concentric defenses toward the Temple Mount. On the 9th of Av, a date already burned into Jewish memory as the anniversary of the First Temple's destruction by Nebuchadnezzar 6 centuries earlier, the Second Temple burned. The Romans took everything: gold, silver, the sacred vessels, the menorah. Everything that could be carried was carried. Titus returned to Rome and celebrated a triumph, a formal victory procession through the streets of the city that included the spoils of Jerusalem displayed for the Roman public to see. And the evidence of that moment survives to this day. The Arch of Titus, still standing in the Roman Forum, contains a relief carving showing Roman soldiers carrying the menorah through the streets of Rome. The treasure existed. The Romans took it. The stone says so. But here is what the stone does not say. Here is the question that the Arch of Titus, for all its magnificent preservation, cannot answer. Was that everything? Because between the beginning of the revolt in 66 CE and the fall of Jerusalem in 70 CE, there were 4 years. 4 years in which the priests of the temple, the community of Qumran near the Dead Sea, and the leadership of the Jewish resistance knew with increasing certainty that the Romans were coming and that the Romans were not going to stop. 4 years in which people who understood what the temple treasury contained and what it meant had time to think about what to do with it. This is where the copper scroll enters the story. The caves of Qumran, cut into the cliffs above the western shore of the Dead Sea, were discovered by Bedouin shepherds in 1947, one of the most consequential accidents in the history of archaeology. Over the following years, systematic excavation of the area produced thousands of manuscript fragments representing hundreds of documents, the oldest known copies of most books of the Hebrew Bible, sectarian texts describing the beliefs and practices of the community that had lived there, and a range of other materials that transformed scholarly understanding of Judaism in the period around the Common Era. Cave 3 was excavated in 1952. Most of what it contained followed the established pattern: leather fragments, papyrus remnants, the usual materials. And then, toward the back of the cave, the excavators found 2 rolled cylinders of heavily oxidized metal, copper, hammered thin, and inscribed with text. The two pieces, it became clear, were two halves of a single document. Getting it open took 3 years. The copper was too brittle and too corroded to unroll. Any attempt would have shattered it. Eventually, a scholar at Manchester University developed a technique to cut the scroll into strips using a fine-toothed saw, allowing the sections to be read individually. When the text was finally assembled and translated, the lead archaeologist on the project, John Allegro, recognized immediately that what he was holding was unlike anything else from Qumran. It was not scripture, it was not theology, it was not the rules of a religious community or a commentary on biblical text. It was an inventory, 64 entries, each describing a location and what was hidden there. The language was practical, geographic, specific, directions given in terms of distances and landmarks, references to named locations, descriptions of how deep to dig and what to look for. And the quantities were staggering. In the first entry alone, 25 talents of silver. A talent was roughly 30 kilograms. Entry after entry described similar amounts: gold, silver, sacred vessels, tithes, scrolls. One entry described 65 gold bars, another 900 talents of silver. Scholars who attempted to total the amounts across all 64 entries arrived at figures representing dozens of tons of precious metal, a quantity so large that it exceeded, by some calculations, the total known gold production of the entire ancient world in that period, which immediately raised the question that has divided scholars ever since. Is it real? The majority of mainstream archaeologists and biblical scholars have argued that it cannot be a literal inventory. The amounts are simply too large to be historical. The scroll, they suggest, may be a record of idealized or symbolic temple wealth, the kind of document that a religious community might produce to describe what the temple treasury was supposed to contain in a theological sense, not what it actually contained in a physical one. Or it may be a literary composition, a text in the genre of hidden treasure stories that existed in the ancient world, not intended as a practical guide, but as a spiritual or eschatological statement. Others disagree, and their argument is harder to dismiss than it might initially appear. John Allegro, who was among the first to read the scroll and who spent years pursuing its implications, argued passionately that the copper scroll was exactly what it appeared to be, a real inventory of real objects hidden in real locations. His argument rested partly on the material itself. Nobody in the ancient world, he pointed out, hammered a symbolic or literary document into copper. Copper was expensive, it was heavy, it was difficult to work. You used copper when you needed a document to last, when the information it contained was too important to risk on materials that might decay. A theological text or a literary composition would have been written on leather, like everything else at Qumran. The choice of copper suggests that whoever made it intended it to survive and to be found and used. The locations described in the scroll are also real. Many of the place names match known sites in ancient Judea. Some of the geographic descriptions correspond to identifiable landscapes. Several researchers over the decades have attempted systematic searches of the locations they believed the scroll was describing. And while nobody has announced a discovery, the searches have not been obviously wrong-headed. The geography works, the distances make sense, the landmarks where they can be identified exist, and there is a historical context that makes the scroll's existence entirely plausible. In the years between 66 and 70 CE, as the Roman campaign moved inexorably toward Jerusalem, Jewish communities throughout Judea had every reason and sufficient time to hide valuables. This was not unprecedented. Ancient peoples routinely concealed treasures during periods of military threat, and archaeology periodically uncovers exactly such hoards, objects buried in expectation of a crisis that never ended. The community at Qumran itself hid its scrolls in the caves, presumably for the same reason. Why would they not also hide physical treasure? The Dead Sea Scrolls scholar Judah Lefkovich has argued that the copper scroll represents the actual inventory of temple treasure hidden by priests who knew the Romans were coming and had the presence of mind, in the final years before the fall, to distribute the most sacred and most valuable objects of the temple treasury across dozens of locations throughout Judea, too dispersed to be found by a single search, recorded in a document durable enough to survive until the crisis passed, and the objects could be retrieved. The crisis never passed. The people who made the scroll, or who knew where it led, died in the war or in its aftermath. The locations were never revisited. The treasure, if it exists, has been in the ground for nearly 2,000 years. The copper scroll itself is now in the Jordan Museum in Amman, mounted in careful sections behind protective glass, available for visitors to see. Scholars continue to argue about it. The debate has not moved toward resolution in 70 years. If anything, it has become more entrenched, with each side holding positions that the other finds unconvincing. The mainstream view that it is symbolic has never been definitively proven. The minority view that it is literal has never produced a discovery that would confirm it. What makes the scroll genuinely different from other ancient treasure mysteries, from the legends of buried Inca gold or the stories of Templar vaults, is precisely its specificity. It does not describe treasure in vague terms. It does not gesture toward a general region or offer symbolic clues. It gives distances. It names landmarks. It specifies depths. It distinguishes between gold and silver, and sacred vessels and scrolls. It reads, in other words, exactly like something written by a person who knew exactly where 64 things were buried and wanted to make sure someone else could find them. Whether that someone was ever meant to find them in this world or the next is the question nobody has answered. And somewhere in the hills and valleys of what was once ancient Judea, in the rocky terrain around Jerusalem, near the wadis and ruins and ancient cisterns that dot the landscape of the West Bank, 64 locations described in careful detail on a scroll made of copper are either empty ground or the greatest undiscovered archaeological find in human history. The scroll has been read, the locations have been studied, the arguments have been made and refined and contested across generations of scholarship, and the treasure, if it ever existed, if it was ever hidden, if the priests who hammered those words into copper were doing exactly what they appear to have been doing, is still there, waiting, as it has waited for 2,000 years, for a document that may be the oldest treasure map ever made. That is a remarkable record of patience. If this story stayed with you, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss upcoming videos and can uncover more forgotten chapters of history. See you in the next video.